Figures 4.6 through 4.8, Gradebook calculating the class average with counter-controlled repetition. Now in this example we're going to slightly enhance the gradebook class that we studied in the previous lesson, and in particular we're going to be adding a new method called determine class average. Now the reason I'm looking at the main function first here is I want to talk a little bit about what I like to call straight line code. As you can see here, we're declaring a gradebook object and initializing it with the string CS101 C++ programming. We're then saying to that gradebook object display message, which is of course going to display a message that contains the course name, and then we're telling that gradebook to determine the class average. Now when you're working with objects, it's not uncommon to have very little logic wrapped around the statements that interact with that object, and that's because the logic is often encapsulated into the methods of the class. So the way we've implemented this particular version of the gradebook class, and specifically the determine class average method, is when we tell the gradebook to determine the class average, it is going to input the grades, 10 of them in this case, calculate the class average, and display the results. And it's very common to encapsulate functionality into methods of a class. Now, when we get to more robust versions of the class called gradebook, we might consider, rather than having the method actually input and calculate the class average, having it just calculate the class average and doing the input a little bit differently. And we'll certainly cover cases like that as we proceed through these live lessons. So let's go ahead and take a look at our gradebook class, and specifically at the header file first. And the only new feature is the function prototype for determine class average, which is going to receive no parameters and return void, return nothing. Let's look at the implementation of the determine class average method. The rest of the methods that you see here are identical to the last version of class gradebook in the prior lesson. So we're going to focus exclusively on the determine class average member function of the gradebook class, which receives no parameters and returns void. And what we've done here is implemented the algorithm for calculating the class average for a class of 10 students. So we've got a few variables that we've declared at the beginning here. Total, grade counter, grade, and average. Total is where we'll store the sum of all the grades so far. Grade counter will keep track of what grade we're about to enter out of the 10. Grade is where we'll store that grade, and the average in this example is calculated as an integer, but of course we could calculate it using floating point numbers as well. For example, we could use the data type double for that purpose. Now, at lines 53 and 54, we are initializing the total to 0 and the grade counter to 1. And as a reminder, C++ does not initialize variables for you, so it's extremely important that things like totals and counters get initialized by you, the programmer, before you use them in the program. And by the way, we could have incorporated these initializations directly into the declarations, which we'll demonstrate in other examples. So here is the C++ while repetition statement. Most languages have a while or similar repetition statement, and the syntax for it in C++ is the while keyword followed by a set of parentheses in which you find the condition that keeps this loop executing as long as the condition remains true. So we call that the loop continuation condition. So in this case, as long as grade counter is less than or equal to 10, we'll keep iterating. We'll prompt the user to enter a grade, and then we will read that value in. We will add that value to the total by taking the current total plus the grade and storing it in the total. A little bit later we'll take a look at the plus equals operator for shortening this statement. And then at line 62 we add 1 to the grade counter, and we'll show you at the end of this lesson the plus plus operator, which can be used for incrementing an integer variable. So we'll do this loop 10 times, then we'll calculate the average as an integer in this case, so we're going to get a whole number result, and then we'll display the total and we'll display the average. So let's go ahead and run the program, and it's pretty straightforward. So let's just enter some grades. So So I've entered 10 grades. We can see that the total is 791. The class average is 79. Of course, if we do this with floating point numbers, it should be 79.1, and we will do it with floating point numbers later. For the moment, we're sticking with just the simple int data type. So the key thing in this example was that we were enhancing the class gradebook with this new method, determine class average, and then again just focusing on this concept of straight line code, which is very common when you're interacting with an object. You create the object and you send it messages, do something, do something, do something again. And because of that, you often in your main program or your controlling program, you will often not have the type of logic that you would have in a procedural programming language.